So now to tonight's panel, we would love to welcome Dr. Louise de Waal and Dr. Kaylee Marnewick and Dr. Neil de Cruz, starting off this evening with Dr. Louise de Waal, who is the Bloodlines Director and Campaign Manager and a member of the Ministerial Task Team, as well as Dr. Kaylee Marnewick, Senior Lecturer at Tshwane University of Technology, member of the Ministerial Task Team, and currently serving on the second Ministerial Task Team. And then Dr. Neil de Cruz, Head of Wildlife Research at World Animal Protection. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing on my side and hand over the screen to Louise. Louise, it is all yours.
Thank you very much. Yes, I will be kicking off tonight. I will try and keep this as short as possible because obviously we've got three presenters tonight. So what I want to do is kick off with giving you an overview on where we are in the ultimate closure of the captive lion industry in South Africa. Starting with a very brief introduction into the history, how we got to where we are in the process of closing the industry, and I will share some of the top-line findings of the Ministerial Task Team and the recommendations for voluntary exit options. So how did we actually get here? And how did it happen, this complete turnaround? I think years of global pressure, amongst others, led to the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee for Environmental Affairs to convene a colloquium in August 2018 on captive lion breeding for hunting in South Africa, harming or promoting the conservation image of the country. That colloquium was a very interesting one, took a lot of people, and a set of recommendations came out of that colloquium that were adopted by the National Assembly in December 2018, I think it was. And then one of the recommendations was that the then Department of Environmental Affairs should, as a matter of urgency, initiate a policy and legislative review of captive lion breeding for hunting and lion bone trade with a view to putting an end to this practice. I think that was the very first big step that led to the minister establishing a high-level panel of experts to review policies, legislation, and practices on matters of elephant, lion, leopard, and rhino management, breeding, hunting, trade, and handling. And then in respect of the captive lion industry, they recognized a long list of issues and challenges. And some of the more pertinent ones I've listed here. And I just want to highlight a couple of those. That rewilding of captive lions is not feasible from conservation principles, and captive breeding is currently not necessary for conservation purposes. The industry, with all its associated spin-off activities, threatens South Africa's reputation as a leader in conservation of wildlife as well as ecotourism destination. It provides limited economic activity and does not contribute meaningfully to transformation. There are major welfare contraventions in the industry in general, and Kelly will talk a little bit further around welfare issues. And that the trade in lion derivatives threatens wild lions and stimulates illegal trades, which Neil will touch on. And then that there is also a risk of zoonotic disease transmission. So, and there was quite a lot more that they have all highlighted in the report that that the minister made public. Now, that report and its recommendations were made public in 2020, and Minister Barbara Creecy announced that Cabinet adopted the HLP majority recommendations on captive lions. And at the time, which was the 2nd of May 2021, She stated that the department will be adopting the majority recommendations on these issues with the goal that South Africa does not breed lions in captivity, keep lions in captivity, or use captive lions in and their derivatives commercially. Now, this announcement by the minister was an absolutely vital point in time. At the time, she said that in terms of policy decisions, that she proposed an immediate hold on the sale of captive lion derivatives, hunting of captive bred lions, and also tourism interactions with captive lions. However, these decisions have not actually been implemented as yet, or legislation amended, which means that the industry is still fully legal and thriving. So that sort of very, very brief history led to the establishment of the ministerial task team. And that was December 22, because the minister felt that a well-supported process of voluntary exit could actually help the implementation of the HLP recommendations. As a result, the MTT had a very narrow mandate to identify and recommend voluntary exit options and pathways for the captive lion industry. So that was, as I say, extremely narrow. The terms of reference included a few other things like process of engagement with stakeholders and to oversee a national audit of existing captive lion breeding and keeping facilities. And that is something that I want to sort of share some of the results with you, as well as develop, obviously, and oversee the implementation of voluntary exit strategy and pathways. And then we also had to look at potential funding mechanisms. So it's actually the national audit and the voluntary exit strategies that I want to focus on. So some of the top line findings from that national audit, and unfortunately, there isn't really time to go into the methodology, which was quite lengthy and complicated, but we managed to get a decent amount of data. And we already knew that South Africa had a substantial number of captive lion facilities as well as lions. And the actual data that we established from that national audit identified 342 facilities and 7,838 lions. Now, most of those lions are in the Free State, Northwest, and Limpopo, as well as most of the facilities are in those three provinces. Actually, 93% of the lions and 82% of the facilities are in those three particular provinces. The Free State is currently the largest population of captive lions, of 3,226, which, as it is the province where most of the breeding takes place. A lot of these lions are then exported to mostly the Northwest and to Limpopo for hunting purposes. When we look at all the other provinces, as you can see, the very slithery little bits in the pie chart are the Western Cape, Eastern Cape, Gauteng, Mpumalanga, and KwaZulu-Natal. And they only house a combined total of 7% of all the captive lions. And the Northern Cape is the only province with no captive lions. So all the data that we are going to see is actually from 8 different provinces. So we then looked at the facility size. We grouped them in categories of 20s, 1 to 20, 21 to 40, etc. We did a count within each of those groups by province, and we plotted that in this nice little graph. And if we sort of look at it in a table, combined numbers, we can see that 72% or just over 72% of facilities have less than 20 lions. and only a very small number, 1.2%, which is actually 4 facilities, have more than 180 lions. So basically, it means that most facilities are relatively small, and that we have a very small number of large industry players that have captive lion populations of more than 100, which is this part of the graph. And again, when we look at who they are, those are people located in the Northwest, Free State, and Limpopo. So we then looked at historical data as well from 2005 to 23. So this includes the data from the ministerial task team. And we looked at the changes of the captive lion industry over time. If we look at the red bars, which is the number of lions, we see that there is a steady growth over time. And it's actually an increase by over 200%. If we then look at facilities, those are the blue bars, we again see a steady growth, but an even bigger growth over time by nearly 600%. But then if we look at the yellows, which is the number of lions per facility, then we see that there is a slight decline over time. So when we actually look at the number of captive lions per facility, that decreased by 54% over time. So the reason for this is unclear, but it can be explained by a diversification in animals. So bringing in, having less lions and more other species. And we had a look at number of predators, although this data set is not absolutely accurate and complete, but it gives us some indication, and we see straight away that there's a wide range of other predators available already in this industry. Indigenous species, caracal surfal cheetah, leopard, as well as exotics like jaguar and tiger. And the incomplete data even showed 2,315 predators, other predators in the industry in total. Again, the purpose for those, and most of those are actually tigers and cheetah, as you can see. The purpose is not 100% clear, but we know that the live export of these predators for zoos, commercial purposes, and breeding captivity overseas is prevalent. And we are also seeing a change where tigers are actually starting to supplement lions. And because they're a non-indigenous species, regulations are often weaker. So, for example, in the Northwest province, to hunt a tiger, only the permission of a landowner is required. It is actually quite ironic when we look at this industry that it mushroomed around the lion bone trades that actually supplemented the tiger bone trades for uses such as tiger bone wine, and now tigers are starting to supplement lions in South Africa with the looming changes in legislation. I think it's also important to remember that the breeding, hunting, and trade in these other predators or their parts and derivatives actually pose exactly the same risks for South Africa as a country as for lions, including welfare concerns, including the threat to conservation and tourism reputations. So yeah, there is no, from that perspective, no difference. Gosh, already 13 minutes. So then looked at lion bone stockpiles. Since 2019, facility owners have started to retain various parts and derivatives in the hope that there would be a legal lion bone quota again. We identified more than 3,000 lion skeletons are stockpiled with further skulls, skins, and considerable weight in bones. the Northwest province hold the highest proportion of facilities with line bone stockpiles. Again, this data is not 100% accurate. The Free State noted that their data was deficient. Also, taxidermists are likely to hold line skeletons, and those numbers are not included here. But it gives us a good indication of quantities that are stockpiles. Obviously, since the High Court ruling in 2019, there has been no legal line bone quota, but we do know that there is illegally line bones being exported from South Africa. And again, Neil, I know that you will touch on that. Compliance and enforcement has been criticized in this industry, and we know that DEFI, Biodiversity and Enforcement and Compliance Units, in collaboration with provincial EMIs, conduct regular compliance inspections, and we looked at that data as well. So between 2015 and 20, there were 257 facilities that were inspected. And a total of 100 facilities were actually non-compliant, which is nearly 40%. So it shows that compliance is a serious and ongoing issue without any easy solutions. The non-compliance mostly involved facilities operating with expired permits or non-compliance with permit conditions. And those can vary from lack of proper record keeping, non-functioning electric fencing, or not keeping copies of permits on sites, marking of animals, all those kind of issues. However, out of those 100 facilities, only 5 facilities actually faced enforcement action, which is a very, very low number. I also would like to point out that the compliance inspections do not cover animal welfare, as those inspectors are not trained on animal welfare issues, and thus that responsibility falls under the ambit of the NSPCA. There is also a fiscal imbalance in the captive lion industry for the administration of the industry, including enforcement and compliance, and that not only puts pressure on human resources for both the national and provincial nature conservation departments, but also diverts essential nature conservation budget to the administration and monitoring of a commercial industry. So we looked at data collected from these inspections, and we estimated that a compliance inspection costs approximately 8,500 Rand per facility. If we then look at the income from, for example, permits, it's a lot lower. So there's a huge imbalance there. And that creates operational challenges to adequately implement biodiversity conservation functions at national and provincial levels, as well as resource allocation and regulatory compliance concerns. So that fiscal imbalance is something that really needs to be looked at in more detail. So those were some of the top line results from the national audit. And I'm talking way too much. I do apologize, colleagues. I will quickly sort of go on to the voluntary exit options. The members of the ministerial task team deliberated extensively, and we engaged with a wide number of industry stakeholders, looked at all the possible options available. We had to be pragmatic, considering exit options that may seem to be unpalatable. All the potential voluntary exit options underwent a thorough SWOT analysis. We identified unintended consequences, and we did a viability scoring as well. So it was quite a rigorous process. And as a result, it was decided that there were two mandatory prerequisites to all of the voluntary exit options, and that is humane euthanasia of compromised lions, as well as population control. And to that end, a number of protocols were developed with significant input from wildlife veterinarians, including a quality of life assessment protocol. So from that whole process, there was three viable voluntary exit options. And the first one is the humane euthanasia of all lions, which means both healthy and compromised lions. And the owner basically gives consent to have all his lions humanely euthanized in agreement with wildlife veterinarian, and exits from the industry immediately and completely. The second one is phase out through trade opportunities, where the healthy lions remain the property of the owner and can be utilized under the current legal restricted TOPS activities for a limited phase out period of preferably not longer than 2 years. No tactile animal interactions is allowed during that trade out period, and protocols have to be applied. And the third one is to surrender lions to lion safe havens. Some or all of the healthy lions are then surrendered by the owner, removed from the property, and placed in lifelong care of an existing lion safe haven or sanctuary. All of those options will be put in place with contractual arrangements with very clear terms and conditions, so no more lions can be purchased by the business, and that animal welfare and well-being is guaranteed for any remaining lions. There are also three slightly less viable voluntary exit options. The surrender of lions to authorities. So all the lions healthy and compromised are then surrendered, removed from the property, and placed in the care of the authorities. Now, this will obviously mean that the owner leaves the industry permanently and immediately, but the burden and the responsibility of those lions then lies in the hands of the governments. The repurposing of the facility to lion safe haven. So healthy lions remain in ownership, but the facility will need to be repurposed to a lion safe haven where animals will stay for the remainder of their lives. No breeding, no human-wildlife interaction, no trades. This option requires a change in mindset and ethos by the owner, which can be challenging. And it also requires a substantial investment in terms of upgrading infrastructure to meet suitable welfare requirements, health check, long-term care of lions, etc. So these kind of things are the reasons why they were less viable. And the last one, repurposing for biodiversity conservation. Again, and here all the captive lions are removed, and then the property is repurposed to support biodiversity conservation. Now, again, this is quite challenging because of the substantial cost involved in, for example, dismantling in the existing infrastructure, and also ecosystem restoration, etc. I think that is not so short. I was hoping it was shorter overview, and I will now hand over to Neil.
Yes, hello everyone. So yeah, following on from Louise, just as a recap, I'm a wildlife researcher who has been focused on various elements of South Africa's commercial captive lion breeding industry, including its potential impacts, how it's being regulated, and what types of things might influence consumer demand for the various different lion products, if you will, that come from these facilities. And I work with World Animal Protection, which is an animal welfare focused NGO that has recently published a report and a scientific paper, which I've contributed to. So just as a bit of a recap, as Louise had pointed out, in terms of the legality, from an international perspective, it's a very different scenario to what's happening domestically or nationally at a provincial level and a national level. So the international export of lion bones, claws, skulls, and teeth originating from these lion farms is currently illegal. And this follows the aforementioned High Court declaration in 2019, in which lion bone export quotas were declared as unconstitutional. So subsequently, that international trade is technically permissible under CITES, the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species of Flora and Fauna, if the right paperwork is in place. But because no official export quotas for lion skeletons have been set, that's the premise of the illegal nature of those exports. So again, these farms are involved in a lot of different activities, from cub handling to walking to lions, to canned hunts, to kind of a range of different commercial activities. But another element I wanted to draw attention to is that while many of these are publicly accessible, they're open to the public, tourists can come and gain access. For example, again, as having direct contact with these big cats. However, many of them, or a substantial number, are also located in remote locations, and they're not open to the public, off-grid essentially. And what I wanted to give a bit of insight is to how in late 2002, we received some quite disturbing intelligence from anonymous sources who were employed at some of these off-grid lion farms. So essentially, the picture that really started to come out from speaking to them at length through structured interviews was that we're really looking at a well-established and effective legal operation, which is simultaneously plugged into an illicit trade network. Specifically, sources told us about the involvement of some captive lion facilities in that international big cat bone trade for use as traditional medicine. So what was happening is that where you've got, after a canned trophy hunt, the skin, the paws, and the skull of the lions are being prized by trophy hunters, the bones are coveted for this illegal wildlife trade and by the traffickers involved in it. So in terms of the specifics of what happened, what we were described by these sources was how entire carcasses, lion carcasses, would be left intact and then packed into cardboard boxes ready for shipment and for Asian bone buyers to come and collect them. This was, first of all, as we were told, to certify authenticity, ensure that they are lion bones, and also to ensure that there weren't any tracking devices that had been put into the bones or into the shipment that would mean that they would come into the scrutiny of the law later down the line. And we also got really interesting and an insightful kind of snapshot into the types of activities and tactics that some of these facilities would use, such as security cameras, patrols, messaging apps, all things used to avoid detection should they have a tip-off that an inspection is coming their way. Beyond the kind of pure legality element that I mentioned, element that I mentioned there, the sources also talked to us about and reported on unethical animal welfare practices that were taking place at some of these types of facilities. They spoke to really concerning elements about the animal's welfare, such as malnutrition, lack of clean water, dirty enclosures, minimal veterinary treatment, lack of enrichment and shelter, and a whole host of other husbandry practices, poor husbandry practices. But what really shocked us was how one source actually described an instance where lions were kept on premises that were being deliberately starved through the low hunting season, reportedly, according to them, as a cost saving measure, for economic reasons, which really raised concerns. But jumping back to illegality, another really interesting and concerning insight was related to how some hunts were carried out in small enclosures that were non-compliant with provincial regulations. And even in some instances, there were the reports and description of how lions were drugged and hunted within an hour of release, which again doesn't meet those kind of provincial regulations. And in one instance, they actually described a scenario where a veterinarian was supplying sedation drugs to non-certified personnel for a certain fee, financial fee, to aid canned hunting. Um, and this is all really concerning, not only because of the ethical elements, but it's against provincial regulations to shoot these animals while they are partially sedated. So again, real insights into what's going on behind the scenes in that regard as well. Beyond the lines themselves, the sources also spoke and provided information about unsafe working conditions for the people working at these types of off-grid facilities. According to them, they were on minimum wage and had limited subsistence allowances. They weren't provided with the type of protective gear that you would expect when slaughtering and preparing the bodies of the animals. And in some instances, they also stated that they felt that they would be threatened with consequences to themselves and their families if they were to speak out about any of the concerning elements that they were seeing on a day-to-day basis. What I also wanted to hark back to, which Louise had mentioned earlier, is I think it's important to remember that it's not just lions that we're talking about here. There are other big cats and predators, big cats like tigers, jaguars, and leopards, and other predators that are being bred too. And there are real concerns that South Africa's legal captive bred tiger industry, as was alluded to earlier, is also contributing to illegal international trade. And this may also be happening with some of those other big cat species on the farms, and that the bones are being used as substitutes for each other. But yeah, again, these big cats are just the tip of the iceberg, as the graph that Louise showed you earlier. You've got from other data sources that we've looked through hire requests from provinces, over 900 carnivores and omnivores, 9 species of felis and canids, all kept at registered private facilities between the years of 2017 and 2020. So it is a much broader diversity of species that we're looking at in this regard. I won't go into this for too much detail, but I guess I just wanted to flag that, like with the ministerial task team, NGOs such as Wildlife Protection and others in collaboration have been having lots of discussions about the different things that we would like to see. There's a whole host of things here on this slide, and likewise on this second slide. But I think the main thing I would want everyone to take away from this is that our research really adds weight to pre-existing concerns about how some of these types of off-grid facilities are operating. Some sadly are using legal activities like captive breeding and canned hunting to fuel and potentially cover their involvement in the illegal wildlife trade. And as such, what it really led us as researchers and policy-minded academics to conclude is that a mandatory phase out is really what's needed. It's difficult to see how voluntary alone, given the legal nexus, will be sufficient to really make a change and to keep to really end in the intended outcome has been stated. So hopefully this gives a really nice overview and snapshot of what we found and why we've got these concerns. And on that note, thank you again, everyone, for your attention. And Kelly, I will pass over to you.
Thank you very much. So we've seen a lot of photographs and heard a lot of discussion this evening from both Neil and Louise of the welfare issues and concerns around the captive lion industry. And I'd like to ask you the question that, do we need happy lions? Does it really matter? So have a look at this picture. Make a quick judgment call. Give me a thumbs up if you can. Do you think this is a happy lion? Are the emojis working for the team? Do you think it's happy? Okay. See some thumbs up happening there. This lion, do you think it's happy? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Anything? There's a cry face. Okay, I think you're saying it's unhappy. How about these guys? Do you think they're happy lions? Thumbs up if you think they're happy. Thumbs up, thumbs down if you think they're not happy. Okay, some thumbs ups happening there. These look like happy lions. What about these lions? Do you think those are happy looking lions or are they sad lions? I'm seeing thumbs down. All right, so how did you make those judgment calls on if those lions were happy or not? You all made those calls without any formal training, or most of you, in lion behavior, lion welfare, lion well-being, but you probably used some inbuilt metric that you've got that measured the welfare of those animals. I mean, and what is lion welfare? I mean, are we talking about, are we lion hugging, tree hugging? Is it sort of the bunny hugger type of thing? There is an internationally recognized definition by the World Organization for Animal Health, and they talk about the physical and the mental state of an animal in relation to the conditions in which it lives and it dies, mental states as well as the physical state. So welfare is actually a growing area of research. It is science-based. And there's a growing understanding that most animals are sentient beings. Even octopuses have been shown to be sentient. And sentient means that these animals can experience pain and they can experience suffering. And there's also a growing understanding that good welfare action also results in good conservation practice in general. And welfare is becoming more and more relevant. And wildlife management is increasingly becoming under more and more scrutiny in terms of the welfare and the practices that we do in managing our wildlife. And this has resulted in changes in the public's perception and expectations on how wild animals are dealt with. And some of the work done by Ross Harvey has shown that South Africa has actually undergone a lot of reputational damage because of the perceived welfare problems around the predator industry in South Africa. And he quantified that at about $2.79 billion over the next decade in terms of reputational damage. And this isn't only related to the captive lion industry. I'm going to ask you for a few minutes just to step back and think more about the wildlife industry as a whole. And I see many people in the meeting do work in the wildlife industry. And there's many practices that we do that are quite controversial in terms of the welfare of the animals. Think about toe clipping in small mammals to mark them for research purposes, branding of domestic and of wild animals. Even catch and release fishing has come under concern for the welfare implications that could result from that. And there's been lots of public outcry around welfare issues that Louise has spoken about earlier, and there's a lot of attention on it. So let's look at some of the welfare issues that we do see and try and relate them back to lions. Louise and Neil both spoke a lot about the captive lion industry and some of the welfare concerns we've seen there. In all the photographs I saw, there's very little enrichment for these animals. They basically in bear camps. There's nothing for them to do. I always compare that to being locked in a room with no Wi-Fi. You've got enough food, you've got enough water, so your welfare is great, right? Not necessarily, because you need the emotional well-being also to be considered. And that includes things like social grouping. It includes things like choices that the animals can make in what they do, where they go, what they eat, how they eat it. Nutritional deficiencies have got welfare concerns. Killing methods of animals. We're not saying that you can't kill animals. You can kill animals and consider their welfare and do it in a humane way. But when the methods of killing don't consider the welfare of animals, we're very problematic. And then the captive hunting of lions. We've seen videos doing circulation where the lions aren't killed straight away, and that they are then, their welfare is not prioritized. But we've also got to consider even how we manage our wild and our managed wild lions, how we translocate these animals, how we reintroduce them, how we do these in ways that minimizes the stress on the animal and maximizes the welfare environment for that animal. In immobilizing animals, the drugs we use, the techniques we use, in putting collars on animals, are the collars the best possible collars that we can afford that won't harm the animal, that will give us good data? How we release animals, how we do population manipulation when we're managing our lions. I saw questions in the chat box earlier about, releasing captive lions in the wild. There really is no need for that. Most of our managed wild lions and our fenced reserves are under some form of population control, be they contracepted, unilateral hysterectomies to reduce cub sizes, etc. And all of those also have welfare concerns linked to those. And also in terms of damage causing animals, when animals get out of parks and they either cause damage or they frighten people or they have the potential to injure people, a lot of the time this is dealt with in ways that doesn't include the animal's welfare. This is either in the animals being killed in illegal or inhumane ways. It could be multiple returns back to the park where the animals are captured, put back in the park, where they're often under social pressure with other male lions pushing them out. And we catch them and put them back in the park again. And they go, oh my gosh, there's more big lions in here. I want to get out. And we put them back out again. They get back out and we catch them, put them back in again. And those also have welfare concerns around them. How we euthanize these animals and how we deal with the human element and human welfare around these issues. So when lions are escaping from parks and they're causing damage to people, they can have an impact on food security and they can have an impact on human safety, which then talks back to the human welfare issues. And there's also cultural and belief use of lions. Both in Africa and in the East, there's, particularly in Africa, lots of traditional use around lion parts and derivatives, but there's no easy legal way for people to access these parts and derivatives in ways for them to fulfill their traditional needs. So they're forced into either inhumane or unregulated killing methods to meet their traditional needs. So we do have a legal framework around welfare, but it really is lacking. The most important piece of legislation is probably the Animal Protection Act, highlighted here, of 1962. So really not really very current. And that talks mostly around housing and transport and capture and care of wild animals. There's a whole bunch of other legislation here, which isn't really the key focus. And we've got this issue where the NSPCA, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, they own the legal mandates to implement and to look after and to police animal welfare in South Africa under the SPCA Act. But it's a really flawed system. The NSPCA is a donor organization. They're reliant on donor funding. They're under-resourced, and they just cannot possibly get to all regulation and inspections that need to be done. And the Animal Protection Act, it's great for 1962, but it really only comes into effect after the abuse has taken place. So it's not proactive in preventing the suffering of animals. We've also had a real challenge in that we've got a problematic mandate around welfare in South Africa. So our Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, that is the department who oversees most of our biodiversity conservation. They are the ones who issue permits to keep lions, possess lions, and do any other activity that's restricted under tracts. But they've got no welfare mandates. The welfare mandate falls under DELRAD, which is Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. But they've got very little to say in who issues permits of captive lions, where the lions are, etc. And they're mostly focused on agriculture and rural development. So we've got this real gap in the mandates, and falling through that gap are the captive lions. So in 2016, things did start to change. The NSPCA took our government to court. And one of the beautiful things of living in South Africa is we've got a really liberal constitution and we can sue our own governments. And sometimes we can win in that process. And this then drives change in our legislation and how we do things. And this is what happened back in 2016. And it's a very long legal document, but the really interesting part that came out of it was that the judgment said that the rationale behind protecting animal welfare has shifted from merely safeguarding the moral status of humans to placing intrinsic values on animals as individuals, and that guarding the interests of animals reflects our constitutional values. So animals don't have rights in South Africa, only people have rights in South Africa, but it is our constitutional responsibility to make sure that the animals under our care are well cared for. So all of that, along with the high-level panel recommendations, resulted in well-being being included under our NEM which is some of our environmental management legislation, which puts well-being underneath the mandate of environmental affairs. They used the term well-being because they couldn't use the term welfare because that would be a contradicting mandate under agriculture. And a definition was proposed for well-being, which was the holistic circumstances and conditions of an animal which are conducive to its physical, psychological, and mental health and quality of life, including its ability to cope with its environment. And that was great. And we now finally had this piece of legislation falling under our Department of Forestry and Fisheries. But that is now being exposed to a legal challenge. They're challenging the process by which this term was included. So we're not sure what's going to happen now. There does appear to be political appetite to maintain a clause around well-being under NEMBA, And we just have to wait now and see what happens with this legal challenge from the SA Hunters Association. So what does all this welfare mean? Are we just Disneyfying our wildlife? And we do know that a certain amount of stress is good for wildlife populations. We know that a bit of stress does improve survival. It does delay reproductive senescence, and is a natural part of animals' life. But it's about balancing the books, of course, particularly under animals that are under our direct care, to make sure that the welfare concerns that we're exposing animals to are weighed up against the conservation benefits. And what's going to be a challenge going forward is when, or if there is finally a welfare mandate under our Biodiversity Act, is we're going to have 9 different provincial conservation authorities and a national body who need training for officials, because officials have got no training in welfare and have had no mandates under welfare or well-being to date. But fortunately, welfare is science and evidence-based, and there are ways of doing this. So the very basic model will be the 5 freedoms, and these are essentially the freedom from first hunger and malnutrition, the freedom from thermal and physical discomfort, the freedom from pain, injury, and disease, freedom from fear and distress, and freedom to express normal behavior. And this sounds really great on paper for animals that are in captivity, but think back to these lines. Let's try and apply the 5 freedoms. Do you think these lions are ever free of thirst, hunger, and malnutrition? Highly unlikely. Wild lions are thirsty, wild lions are hungry, and wild lions have a bit of a hard time out there. They're not free from thermal and physical discomforts. They're not free from pain, injury, and disease. Those two, I think one of those guys is going to be pretty sore after this encounter. There's a lot of fear and distress when you're a wild lion. You know, the landscape of fear is a very important part of the lion's social structure. And do they have freedom to express their normal behavior? Absolutely. So what we see here is that the 5 freedoms isn't necessarily a useful tool for evaluating animals that aren't in direct control of human beings. So we do have the 5 domains model. And this is a more workable model, and that says that animal welfare is subjective depending on the conditions the animal is being kept in. So they look at 5 functional domains: the nutritional domain, the environmental domain, the health, behavioral, and then the overall mental state and well-being. And you then relate those back to the environments that the animal is finding itself in, be it a fully captive animal or an animal in the Kruger National Park. But there is a growing welfare model called One Welfare, and this came out as part of a high-level panel too. And ideally, what we'd like to see in the long term is a movement towards One Welfare. It's a growing global model. It's a non-Western centric approach to animal welfare, and it really recognizes that animal welfare, biodiversity, the environment, and human well-being are all very, very strongly interlinked to one another. And this is really valuable in a place like South Africa, where we've got these high incidents of gender-based violence. There's clear links between criminality and violence with vulnerable people and animal cruelty, known as the toxic triage. And there's a very high possibility that someone who's abusing animals is probably also abusing children and their partners, and vice versa. So, you know, a one welfare approach would be a very useful tool in South Africa to not only benefit animals, but to benefit people too. And I can't help thinking about the instance that was reported in the news recently, I think it was in Limpopo, where I think 2 ladies were shot and killed on a farm, and they threw their bodies into the pigsty, which is horrendous. And then I started to think, but what conditions are these pigs being kept in, where you've got rotting human bodies in a pigsty? And I thought, I wonder if, you know, the animal welfare was being well policed and well cared for in that environment. Maybe there could have been an early warning system. Maybe you could have seen that pig farm very likely wasn't having ideal animal welfare standards. And maybe some intervention at that stage could perhaps have prevented something more tragic down the line. So in conclusion, you know, our legal environment in South Africa is changing. There is a move to really include welfare under our biodiversity legislation. There's an increased awareness of welfare and well-being, not only in captive animals, but also in the animals that are under our control for management and conservation. And there's an increasing understanding that how we treat animals defines us as a society, and that improving animal welfare also improves human welfare, which is a win all around. Thank you.
Thank you to our panel of guest speakers for this introduction. And I think this really just is the introduction, because I suspect that there will be a lively question and answer session. Thank you for this overview. I think in this you hold up a mirror to us and we ask important questions from ourselves as a conservation community, such as, what is the place of emotion in science and conservation? Does it have any place? And ask questions regarding our own morality in this regard, which I think is very, very important. It is fantastic, though, to see that the three of you are on the ministerial panel, and while you are on the panel, you are still critical of the government. That is a very, very positive sign. That you can do that it's a huge step in the right direction. If I think about where this process was when Steffi presented on this platform the first time and where it is now, a lot happened. There's always more to do, but I think we want to acknowledge the work that you and others are doing, and very grateful for taking this issue forward and placing it in the public platform. So with that, we want to invite our audience to start asking questions. You are most welcome to raise your virtual hand. There are already some difficult and interesting questions in the chat, but we would love to invite you to raise your hand and ask your questions, because some of the questions in the chat are very, very long. So if those people would also like to raise their hand, you're welcome to do so. And we ask everybody to please stay on and participate. Thank you very much. And Mark Jones, your hand was up first. Please go for it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for those excellent presentations. I'm Mark Jones. I'm based in the UK. I work for the Born Free Foundation. We've had some involvement along the line in trying to follow these processes and respond to consultations. We took part in the colloquium back in 2019, and we've maintained a strong interest in this issue. And thank you, Kelly, for mentioning the one welfare concept, which I think is an emerging theme, which is going to be very valuable. But just going back to the captive lion industry and the management of its phase out, if that's where we are at some point in that process, fairly early in that process. Obviously, Barbara Creasy, the former minister at DFFE, has been a central figure in the development of this process. You've had elections and you've had a change in minister earlier this year. You've now got Dion George from the Democratic Alliance in that role. What's the feeling on the attitude of the new government and the new minister on the issue of phasing out lion and other predator breeding in South Africa?
May I answer that, Johan?
Yeah, please go for it. Any of you.
Hi, Mark. Great to see you. We met with the new minister about a month or two ago, shortly after he took up his position, and he's fully on board, and he said he intends to continue the process that Minister Creasy started. So the political will remains with the change of minister.
Yeah, a very good question, Mark, because there was a lot of concern with the change in governments. But it does look that we're still on that same track without any diversions.
Good. Mark, thank you so much for your question. I would just like to acknowledge people joining us from Kenya, Malawi, Scotland, Zambia, USA, Dubai, the UK, Rwanda, and also our colleague in conservation who is tirelessly fighting for the welfare of South African cheetahs and Namibian cheetahs in India, Ravi Chelam. Ravi, if you're still with us, welcome. Great to have you with us. And with that, I would like to welcome Emlyn from Canada to please ask his question.
Thank you, Johan. This is as distressing as it is pleasing to have heard these presentations about both what's wrong, but also what's being done to try and rectify and improve the situation. It's in that vein that I just want to offer a couple of comments in a recent I think, significant development in the press in the US that you might find instructive in South Africa or in Africa. But firstly, I guess with Africa being arguably the bastion in the world of wildlife concerns and considerations and protection and conservation, wouldn't it be great, I ask rhetorically, if the United Nations was to hold, with Africa's encouragement, a world conference, as the UN used to do, on global issues, on the state of wildlife conservation? Because obviously, as much as there is wrong, there is also great progress in making it right. And so one thinks of how it became verboten for killer whales to be kept in captivity, or for other charismatic megafauna, as we like or traditionally called them, to be kept in captivity. And elephants and tigers no longer being permissible in traveling circuses. There's lots of progress. But I would also, en route to my main point, I would just point out that from this continent's perspective in North America, the fact that there are countries in Africa, and I don't know which ones and how much, that trophy hunting of animals that people want to have their heads on walls in their living rooms is a despicable, murderous activity that I hope could come to an end through the advocacy that you people are taking. The point I'd just like to, that I think is so instructive, is that 2 Sundays ago, and you can find this online in the New York Times, in the opinion section, there was an article called "The End of Panda Diplomacy." And if pandas are considered to be sort of an archetypal popular animal in zoos, the article was shocking, I think, in that the week before, or 2 weeks before, cameras followed the FedEx trucks from Washington National Airport or Dulles Airport, transporting each one a panda to the National Zoo, which is part of the Smithsonian Institution. And this was all revelatory to me. I hadn't really thought about this, I'm sorry to say, as much. But then the article, which I urge you all to get, "The End of Panda Diplomacy," in the New York Times 2 weekends ago, is very symptomatic of the problem as a whole, in that this article reveals that these 10-year agreements between China and specific zoos like the San Diego Zoo and the National Zoo are very secretive documents in which neither party is able to share publicly details of illness or mortality or ill health or anything that the public might want to know but can't know because it's all bound in secrecy. They are, of course, sort of just objects of well-being and diplomatic intentions between countries. There really is, at the end of it, some public education, I suppose, but it would be so much better if we weren't doing this in the first place. So I would just make those points and commend to you all both what you're doing and to recommend that Africa consider being the host of a UN conference on one welfare, which I think is a fantastic concept that fits with Africa's desired image globally, and to draw your attention to this article in the Sunday New York Times 2 weekends ago.
Thank you. Emlyn, any comments from the panel? Kelly, go for it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emlyn. I appreciate the input. I think we must be very careful of confusing the hunting of captive bred lions with bona fide sustainable trophy hunting. It's not the same thing, and this is one of the problems we have, is that it blurs the line between sustainable use and captive lion hunting, colloquially called canned hunting. Trophy hunting is one of the tools in our conservation toolkits, and it does help fund our conservation estates. But we are just very, very careful about blurring the lines between the two, because not all hunting is canned hunting or captive hunting. Thanks. And I don't want to host a UN conference, but if somebody would like to organize one, I'll definitely take part.
Yeah, I completely concur with Kelly that when we talk about a captive lion industry, we're talking about hunting of lions that have been captive bred. And that is a very different scenario altogether. I think the two need to be looked at and discussed in very separate settings, under very separate conditions, and the separate arguments to both. So I think to actually discuss the two issues in a similar in a same discussion is very confusing, and as Kelly says, blurs the lines, which is not the right thing to go about. It's a very different thing altogether.
Yeah, I think for the sake of the legal process, it helps to keep the lines very clear.
Yes, yes.
Max, I saw your question in the chat, and I'm very grateful that you've got your hand up. Please ask your question.
Thank you for the opportunity, everybody. I would just like to ask, since some of these large cats are protected and not specially protected, because it's an obvious that there are those various wildlife animals that are specially protected, for example, like the elephants. Now I would like to ask for the ones, the large cats, for the ones that are based in large national parks, what measures do you take, or under what measures do you undergo to make sure that these large cats are monitored, and that they are protected at all costs, since most of the focus is only based on those specially protected animals, like the elephants, and those that are mainly poached, the elephants and the rhinos.
Okay, that's a big question. Who wants to go for that one?
I think Kelly is probably the best person to
Sorry,
sort of
Kelly.
tackle that one.
Hi, Max. Thanks for the question. So in South Africa, we've got a bit of a different structure to our wildlife ownership than the rest of Africa. So in South Africa, a private person can own an animal. So you can own a lion in South Africa, or a giraffe, or a rhino, or whatever it may be. So that's, if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're asking, how does a protected animal end up in captivity or being utilized in that way? Is that your question?
Not exactly, but I wanted to know the type of measures that you take to make sure that these captive animals are protected at all costs, and that they are not used for illegal purposes and so on.
So, you know, you do need a permit to keep a captive lion. And those permit requirements vary between which province you're in South Africa. And we do have a list of restricted activities under our national legislation. And those would be things like to keep in captivity, to convey or to transport the animal, to euthanize the animal. You need a permit for any of those restricted activities. And the idea with that is that those activities are then regulated by government, and you can keep track of those activities. The challenge, however, with the legal trade is it's really hard to control the legal trade, because by its very nature, it's illegal. And thus it's done in a clandestine kind of way. So when we did have a lion bone export quota, so we don't have one anymore, there was a requirement of having a DNA from the bones that you want to export, and to prove that those came from captive bred animals. And if you have a captive bred lion in a facility, it's supposed to be microchipped so that you can scan it and you can identify the animal, but we found gross non-compliance in that department. So I think one of the biggest challenges we have is we just don't have the capacity to effectively police the industry, and to make sure that non-compliance is, first of all, detected, and that there's consequences for non-compliance. We don't have the capacity to do that. Thanks. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, Max.
Thank you, Max. Much appreciated. I just want to turn to the chat quickly. If I don't ask the questions in the chat, it's because I think that the question has already been answered. If you feel that your question hasn't been answered, please raise your hand, wave at us. We're not trying to skip any questions there, but we will get to all of them. I'm just quickly going through to the hands that are raised. Casey, please ask your question.
Thank you, everyone. Hello, Kelly.
Hi, Gracie.
I did put a question in the chat, and as we listened, I kind of added to it in my mind. And namely, in my own research, I've worked a fair amount on intersections of illicit trade and illicit organizations and businesses, and particularly within trophy hunting. So I was very interested in the potential of similar evidence in canned hunting, since these are separate notions, but also in regard to all of your policy work in this ministerial committee, if there are considerations or what considerations might be being made in terms of partnering with or preparing or otherwise planning for private industry and an impending closure of canned hunting, so that those industries might protect themselves from exploitation as legal industry to connect them to the illicit trade. Does that make sense? And is that a consideration being made? I imagine things like financial institutions, taxidermists, freight forwarders, the ones that are often exploited in the trophy hunting industry to get more than your trophy home, for example. How does that come in with the canned hunting and the potential closure of that legality? Thank you.
Is this me again?
Well, if you want to start tackling it.
Sure. Yeah, Casey, it is a concern. And, there is this concern that we're going to take this illegal activity and then try and make it illegal, and then it's just going to go underground. That is the one concern. I think also, though, the captive lion hunting proportion of our complete trophy hunting business in South Africa is really, really small. It's less than something like 3 or 8% or something. 3, I think it is percent. And don't quote me on the numbers. Actually comes from captive lion hunting. The rest of all our hunting income comes from buffalo and kudu, etc., etc. So it is quite a small part of the trophy hunting industry. So I think any loss of income that would be experienced through, say, taxidermists, freight forwarders, etc., really isn't. I don't think would be significant. Have I missed your concern?
Yes, only a little bit, and not so much worried about loss of profits for them, concerned that their industries may become vulnerable to exploitation for would-be bad actors wanting to continue or subvert the ban of the trade. And therefore, no. And I think some are knowing players. Let me be honest with my opinion, but some may do well to want to partner and not become part of that potentially illegality that will come when this is eventually banned.
For me,
yes, and there is already. Oh, so Neil, you're going to jump in then.
Kelly, I'll jump in after.
Yeah. No, jump in, it's cool.
Thank you. Casey, I was just going to add, thanks for your question. I saw also what you put in the chat. And for me, a lot of this still revolves around that legal nexus, right? Your question about the sources and what did they do next? Their actual involvement in the trade chain ended there. They didn't know what happened after those boxes went and left that facility. That's where the trail went cold in terms of their involvement. And that's usually part of a calculated process, right? You don't want everyone knowing where it goes down the train. But we do know, with the current state of affairs, that, somebody was arrested with a suitcase of 5 lion bones in the suitcase at the airport of Joburg. So there's definitely illegal activity happening there. But the other thing I would want to flag is that the facilities are acting as a hotspot for illegal trade as well. We do have reports of tigers being and skulls and bones being poached from within these farms. So I guess I just to reiterate your concerns, I think we need clear lines on what's legal and what's illegal. We need clear lines on what's the end goal. Is it, and what does that look like in terms of the mandatory phase out, in my opinion. And then during that, we need to take everybody on that journey. We need to make sure that everyone has a zero tolerance if it is illegal and if it is a mandatory end. And that involves all of the different corporate stakeholders and industries that you've mentioned. So for me, that's where that all comes together and seems to be the direction of travel.
I think there is a need also in South Africa to have more involvement of the green scorpions and to have really more insight into who is actually involved in the illegal trade and how does it actually operate within the country. Because I don't think we really know completely what elements are involved in that illegal trade. And we know it exists because there have been bones intercepted, and since 2019 quite a bit, both at OR Tambo as well as in Leo, where bones from South Africa were intercepted. So we know that trade is happening, but that was not something that within our mandate we could look at as a ministerial task team, and the HLP I don't think had the sort of capacity to look into that either, but there is a need to get better understanding.
Casey, are you happy with the answer? Thank you so much for the question. Simon, I see your hand. I'm just going to go to the chat for a moment. Please don't go away. There's a question from Annette, and I think that Steph might have paid attention to it. But since it is addressed to Louise, this one is coming your way. How do we differentiate between legitimate conservation breeding programs and those focused on commercial exploitation, such as cub petting or canned hunting? Or is it, and then is it justifiable to breed lions in captivity? I think you've answered that one.
Yes, I think that one has been answered. And currently we don't need to breed lions in captivity for conservation purposes. I think how to identify proper conservation breeding and commercial breeding, I think it is sort of any kind of predator. I think we have to be very honest. If you want to do conservation breeding, then the animals need to be kept as wild as possible. And there is no sort of taking the cubs away from the mother and hand rearing them and interacting with them and making sure that there is an income at every single stage of its life. That is definitely commercial breeding. Commercial, the word itself says it already. Money has to be made. The bottom line is important, and hence you try to make the most out of every single stage of an animal's life, from the moment it's born to the moment it dies or is killed. So I think for me it's very easy. Proper conservation breeding, animals are being kept as wild as possible, and they are being used for relocation for proper in situ conservation purposes and not for commercial purposes. Does that answer the question?
Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, does that answer your question, Annette?
Annette, if you have any follow-up question, you're welcome to raise that. But thanks for clarifying that, Louise. Simon, please go ahead and answer your question. Ask your question.
Good evening, guys.
Welcome.
Good evening once again.
Hi, Simon.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
My question is, in the event that captive lions industry is phased out, what will be the most appropriate course of action for the lions currently held in captivity? Given that many of these animals may have may have lost essential survival skills. Will it be feasible or ethical to release them into the wild, or will they need to remain in managed care? If the latter, what changes will be necessary in their current facilities to ensure their long-term welfare while still aligning with the conservation goal?
I'm happy to start this off, Kelly, and if you want to add anything to that, is that okay? I think we have to be really realistic here, Simon. The closure, the actual closure, we've been going or are going currently through a voluntary exits, and there's only going to be a very limited number of people that will hold up their hands and say, yes, we're interested to exit on a voluntary basis. Hence, the number of lions that are going to be involved in that process are going to be a limited number. The process to the actual closure is going to take time because we need changes in legislation to enable that. And to make changes in legislation, that takes time. We're talking at least 2 years. So if that's once we're on that stage where changes in legislations are going to happen and there is public participation and all those processes that need to be gone through in order to facilitate that, I think then the industry knows that, you know, the end of the road is near, and they will start, trading out their lions. So in the end of the day, the number of lions that we would end up with when the industry will be closed is going to be limited. And those lions, we don't have the space to put them back into the wild in South Africa. There's lots of reasons why we probably don't want to do that. There is very limited space in terms of sanctuaries to take care of these animals. That's also very expensive. So there's a very limited number of options available. And that's, we've gone through that as a ministerial task team in terms of looking at voluntary exit options. So you really are looking at either trade out or humane euthanasia. There isn't really many other options available, to be totally honest. And I don't know, Kelly, if you want to add anything to that.
No, I mean, I think that covers it, Louise. But I think the important thing to realize is that many of the lions in the commercial industry were bred to be killed. They were either going to be hunted or become skeletons or something like that. So the end line was as lions being killed. So it just, if there is going to be euthanasia, it just, it would be humane euthanasia as opposed to being hunted in a captive hunt or slaughtered for bones. But we don't have bone trade anymore, so that's very unlikely.
I can just add on to that as well. I think, going back to one of your slides, Louise, and the rapid rise of this industry, I think it really shows the kind of ethical problems that come out when you allow an industry to expand so fast, so quickly. And I think it should be almost a warning shout out for us. Let's think long and hard before we start to commercialize new species and go down that route, because as we're highlighting, there's a lot of management challenges, trying to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak. So it's a really important thing to remember as you're considering other species.
Yeah, and I think this is part of the problem. The government is on this trajectory to phase out the captive lion breeding industry, and the industry will be reacting, and it's already reacting, and tigers or other species are going to replace the lions. So in 5-10 years' time, we could be sitting here again and discussing it, but just different species. So I think you're absolutely right, Neil, and we have to be very careful in what we allow and what we don't allow. And I find it also, I know that there's quite a few people from other African countries here. And I find it very worrying to see that a captive industry is starting to emerge in other African countries, and that they are going onto this route of allowing this to happen. And South Africa should be an example, as a warning, as a red flag. Look, this is not the way forward. We're not in the 1900s anymore. It's 2024. And let's just, see what is humane, what is the right thing to do, what is ethical and what isn't. And as Neil says, once you let the genie out of the bottle, to get the genie back in is a lot more complicated.
Simon, thank you so much for your question. Does that answer your question? Do you have any follow-up question?
Yes, I do have. Let's say in case this lion captivity were bred, and during the closure of that facility, it happens that the facility has small cubs, or very small cubs. And we had seen the country like India that recently sourced cheetahs from Kenya. Accidentally, they died. Yes, such countries. Will it be possible to export such those lions to those countries that need them to restock their wild, or will just be euthanized in the facility? Is it possible?
Well, I think I would like to turn this question around a little bit. So first of all, I think in this process of closing the industry, the first thing we have to do, there has to be a moratorium on breeding. So you stop the population from expanding. That has to happen. It hasn't happened yet, but it's something, if the government really wants to close this industry, that is one of the things we need to do. Secondly, why should we be looking at using captive bred lions? We have no idea about their genetics. We don't know how they would actually deal with the wilds. They've never really lived in social groups. We have plenty of wild lions in South Africa that can be used for that purpose.
And I think, if I can jump in, please, we also have to consider, again, the welfare of the animals. A captive bred animal, the process they can be rewilded, they can hunt, they can be functioning lions again. But that process, if you consider the welfare implications and the stress on that animal compared to if we did the same thing with a wild lion, the welfare concerns would be much more doing that with a captive bred lion too than doing it with a wild lion. So we do in South Africa have lions in our fenced reserves. They're quite heavily managed in terms of their numbers, and those lions could be used for restoration purposes. They're wild lions. They don't need to be rewilded in any kind of way. They can utilize their habitats. They're functioning lions that could quite easily be translocated for restoration purposes. Is it good, Simon?
Yeah, I'm satisfied. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to turn to the chat for a moment. And Kelly, I feel there's a touch of the devil's advocate on this question from Peter Mills. To Kelly, is there any human activity that doesn't have a negative impact on nature? Having said that, shouldn't animal welfare in the wildlife industry be determined by the industry and not left to an overly emotional and out of touch citizenry?
Yes, so everything we do does have an impact. And even in managing our wildlife, even tourism has an impact on animal welfare. We're inclined to talk about photographic tourism being non-consumptive. Some of the research done in some of the parks on the western boundary of Kruger shows that actually trophy hunting is way less consumptive than photographic tourism is, in terms of the number of people you need and tar roads and infrastructure and resource use, etc. So everything we do does have an impact. What we need to be doing is looking at how we utilize that impact in a responsible manner and show that we've shown due diligence in what we're doing. And this is my point exactly when I spoke about, it's not only welfare in captive lions. It's really easy for us as a conservation here to go, oh, the welfare issues in captive animals. There's welfare issues wherever we manage animals. And I agree, we don't want people who don't have to manage wildlife to dictate to us how we manage our wildlife. But that's only going to happen if we as a wildlife industry behave in a responsible manner and actually show that we're doing best practice very proactively. And if we don't, we will get told how to do our management actions and our decision making. So we need to, as an industry, step back and think and say, all right, how are we showing best practice? How are we showing that we consider the welfare of these animals in our conservation activities and our management activities? And essentially, any activity that we do requires a social license. And if we don't have that social license, we cannot do our conservation action. So it's up to us to be leaders and to not be put in a position where we've been told what to do by people who are out of touch and who don't necessarily agree with management of animals.
And I think
Thanks,
when
Kelly.
we look at sorry, if I can just add, if we look at the captive lion industry, that industry has had a lot of chances over the 30 years that it has existed to show that we're willing to put best practices in place. We're willing to look at the welfare of these animals and make sure that what is happening in our industry is ethical. But it hasn't happened. So obviously, the wildlife, or that part of the wildlife industry hasn't been able to self-regulate. And I think self-regulation is there is always an issue with that. You have to be very careful when an industry self-regulates.
Thanks, Louise. Neil, would you like to add anything to the question?
Just briefly, I guess the thing that always comes to my mind when we talk about these kinds of impacts is that I just draw attention that there's a very specific, and you talked about this perfectly in your talk, Kelly, there's a very specific animal welfare burden that we place upon ourselves when you put an animal in captivity that way for commercial purposes. It goes beyond your day-to-day, walking around having your impact on the environment. You've chosen to put this animal in these conditions, and in my opinion, your responsibility there is to minimize animal welfare, to give that animal the best life possible if you're doing that. And so I think we then really come to the ethical moral point. Why is the animal there, and what is the impact and the outcome for it? And then you start taking a step back and look at the reputational damage, the conservation reputation damage. And I think it's just remembering it's very different, an animal in the wild experiencing the stress and natural day-to-day life, and the responsibility you take on when you're commercial captive breeding an animal like that.
Thank you so much. Looking at the welfare of the panel, because we've had you here for an hour and a half already. Are you still okay to carry on for a little bit? There are still some questions left.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Gareth, please unmute and ask your question.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks for the talk and covering an important topic in the country. I did put a message in the chat regarding wild populations and poaching. Kelly did mention that there is traditional medicine used from lions, particularly the head and the feet, and recently we've seen an incident in Wangi. And I don't know if it's coming to the media more, or it wasn't such a thing a little while ago, but poaching in Kruger and Mozambique maybe on the increase. But is there evidence that the captive lion breeding space provided for the traditional medicine industry? And is there concern for wild populations with the proposed bans?
It's an interesting question. Sorry, Kelly, to jump in here. We did engage with traditional health practitioners, and those people, although there is use of lion parts in their practices. They had very little interaction with the captive industry, where they normally get their parts from either wildlife markets or the little muti shops. So I think what needs to be looked at, rather than the traditional health practitioner sector, is actually the interaction between the illegal trades, or potentially the illegal and legal trades, with the bigger wildlife sellers and the wildlife markets. And I think that is an area that has been left very informal in South Africa. It's a very grey area, as you probably know as well. And I think there's an area that we need to look at in more detail, and we need to understand better how that works, and how much of the illegal trade is connected with that sector. I don't know whether that answers your question, Gareth.
Yeah, I guess there's not much data to suggest that there is movement between captive spaces and the traditional muti, but is there any data on lion poaching that is robust enough to say that the trend is decreasing or increasing, and what the consequences on the wild population might be?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely an increasing trend in poaching of wild lions. I don't think that's restricted only to lions, though. I think there's probably all wild animals. But remembering that the South African went, and I know there's this sort of concern that by stopping the export of bones from South African captive lions, that this could trigger the poaching of wild lions to support that trade. But first of all, South Africa, when we did have a bone export quota, you could only export a whole skeleton. You couldn't export what they call bits and pieces. So you couldn't just export like paws and things. You could only export a whole skeleton with a CITES quota. So there never was a CITES permit. There never was actually, under that regime, ever a legal way to export other parts and derivatives except whole skeletons from captive bred lions. When a little bit of research I've done into looking at trends in poaching of lions, it's absolutely a problem, and it shouldn't be downplayed. Most of the poaching that is done is for parts and derivatives. So you're seeing feet, you're seeing the bottom jaw, the front of the face, sometimes the tail, and pieces of skin. There's only been one area where the lions were poached for their bones, and that was on the Mozambican border with the Kruger National Park in the Greater Limpopo TFCA. But from what I've seen, there's been no other poaching of lions for their bones. It's always for the parts and derivatives. And I've even seen there was a spate in South Africa of poaching of captive bred lions for their feet and the front of their faces. So the modus operandi was to poison the captive lions. Pretty easy to do because they're in captivity. You can bait meat, throw it over a fence. The lions die quietly, and then the parts that were taken were generally the feet, the jaw, and the front of the face also.
I think it's also those smaller products like teeth and claws are much easier to export, to put in your suitcase, and people have been intercepted with those. I think there was even a guy in Mozambique that had some teeth or claws in his shoe, I think. So those smaller parts are much easier to illegally export from the country. But there is, at the moment, I don't think we've got any causal evidence that the fact that we have no lion bone quota has increased the poaching of lions in the wild. That connection, I don't think we can make at the moment with the data we have.
If I can just add on the flip side, we've got a research paper that's in development, and we've come at it from a slightly different angle, and we've tried to see what degree of evidence is in the published and grey literature that shows that the captive lion breeding industry is having a benefit for the conservation of wild lions. And at the moment, there's no hard evidence that shows that the industry has had that direct positive impact on wild lion populations. So yeah, there's a lot of unknowns, but again, it's just again highlights, I think, the need for approaching this type of commercialization and commodification with caution.
Thanks, Gareth, for the question. A related question from Mary Dag in the chat would be, I guess what she's asking for is a bit of a profile of the person who is buying the product. And she says, who are the people hunting, in inverted commas, these lions, and where are they from, and why are they doing it?
Yeah, I think, you know,
Volunteers?
so much. I think that market has changed quite significantly due to various restrictions being placed on the importation of captive lion trophies into various countries. So US Fish and Wildlife don't allow the importation of trophies from captive lion hunts. My understanding is most of the EU don't, Australia doesn't. So that market was initially very USA based, but with those inabilities to get a CITES permit to import your trophy back to your country of origin, it really doesn't make the trophy hunting all that worthwhile. So there's definitely been a shift in those markets, and they're probably going to be targeting more of the Eastern countries. I haven't looked at the CITES trade database for a while because we haven't exported that many captive lion. I don't know, Louise, are you up to date on that? Neil, have you looked at those data recently? But I imagine we're probably looking at Russia and the East, those kinds of countries now.
It has very much, as you say, Kelly, it has changed. I think it was 2016 when the US Fisheries and Wildlife changed their whole rules on the importation of captive bred trophies. And if you look at the sort of the profile now, there is a trend of the sort of BRICS countries, if you like, Chinese, the Russians, quite a lot of Eastern European countries. But also there's still quite a few European countries that do come to South Africa for trophy hunting in general, but also the sort of the captive industry, and that includes countries like Spain, Germany, and even a couple of Scandinavian countries. So it's quite a diverse profile now, where before 2016 it was predominantly Americans.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start at the bottom of the chat questions at the moment. A question from Sean Clark. It's great that the new minister is aligned to continue the fight to have the captive lion industry eradicated. However, realistically, what sort of time frame are we looking at for the entity recommendations to be passed into law?
How long is a piece of string?
Yes.
I think, you know, and I think this is why our previous Minister Creasy went for a voluntary exit strategy, because if it's voluntary, then it can happen instantly. For this to be legislated could be 5, 10, 15 years. And we do know that if it is legislated, it's going to be challenged in court. So it's going to get caught up in the legal, the really slow turning legal wheels. So it is a long process to legislate it, which is why the minister has tried this voluntary exit strategy, and also as a result of pressure come from international organizations in other countries. You know, the more we put pressure on the industry, the less they're able to thrive. But very long if it's got to go the legal routes.
Yep.
Louise, you look like you want to comment.
No, I totally agree with Kelly. It is, we don't know, but it's going to take a while. And I think also we have to realize that this is an industry that has been allowed to grow, and we saw in that graph it has grown dramatically, especially in the number of players in this industry for the last 3 decades. To close an industry that has been allowed to trade legally for this long is going to be difficult to close. And we have to take into consideration the welfare and the implications, the sort of unintended consequences in terms of people and animals. So it has to be done responsibly, and that takes time.
Thanks, Louise. Kelly, a question from one of your students.
Mm-hmm.
Question from Selu.
This is a little switch of roles. Hey, Selu.
How difficult is it for one to establish such facilities? Because it looks like the industry is very much saturated. Or you just need money to have such facilities, as many other things where you just need money to bypass everything you're sorted. So you're too young to be that cynical.
They've been in my class too long. I say that's exactly what you need in South Africa. If you can apply for a permit to open a captive facility, if you meet the various legal requirements, which is mostly around camp size and fencing restrictions and marking your animals, and you've got enough money to do all of that, then you can open a facility. There's no legal requirements to show that you've got the ability to care for those lions, that you understand their diet, their behavior, and you've got to have a management plan, which will be compiled by an ecologist, which will then go hand in hand with your application. But it's really just it's a legal application process.
There's an important question from Paul Andre de Georges from the USA, who also taught at UT before. I would be surprised if the Professional Hunters Association of South Africa supports canned lion hunting. Have you attempted to collaborate with them to help shut canned lion hunting down?
Sure. There's a whole new webinar on that topic. Hi, Paul. It's great to see you. There has been a lot of fracture in our hunting industry in terms of who's supporting captive lion hunting and who's not. At one stage, it was only FASA and CHASA who supported it. I believe the new FASA body or the management don't actively support the hunting of captive bred lions, but that's a very new, and I haven't read up on it. But essentially, it was only FASA and CHASA who were supporting that. All the other hunting industries like SA Hunters, etc., have spoken out against it and don't want to be supporting it.
I think there was one point, and I can't remember exactly. I think it was around 2015 when FASA spoke out against canned hunting, but then there was a complete internal debate, and that led to the separation and the establishment of the custodians who don't support canned hunting, and then FASA carried on supporting it. But yeah,
there's an answer from Jeremy in the chat, Jeremy Anderson, who's reflecting exactly what you are saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremy.
I think I'm going to make this the last question from Kaylee Weber. And she's asking a technical scientific question here. Would a RODIS type initiative assist with bringing bigger charges to illegal bone trade? Or is there a lion DNA database already?
Yes, there was, when we were doing the lion bone trade, where under the CITES quota, there was the need to show DNA tracking of the bones that you were exporting. So essentially the idea was that you would take genetic samples from your captive bred lions and you would bank those, and you'd have to show that the bones that you're exporting match your captive bred lions. So we do have the ability to do it. I'm not up to speed on RODIS and how it's going. I know at one stage there was a huge backlog at RODIS, but I don't know how that's going now. But we certainly would have the ability to do that and police it if the resources could be found. What do you think, Louise?
Yeah, I think it is very much a resources and also a follow through and enforcement, because I think it was towards the sort of the end of the line bone trade when that rule came in terms of DNA samples. But then it takes so long for the DNA samples to be analyzed, and then the skeleton is actually somewhere overseas. And I think, you know, on paper, yes, it can work, but the proof is in the pudding, and that is in terms of the enforcement, the regulation and enforcement. And I think we have to also then start to question again, like I was sort of alluding on in my presentation, is we're adding another layer of complexity in terms of monitoring and enforcing a commercial industry. And a lot of that monitoring and enforcement money comes out of a nature conservation budgets. And those budgets are already squeezed in South Africa. So nature conservation on a national and a provincial level are basically paying for the monitoring and enforcement of a commercial industry. So I think that is another thing that we have to start considering. And it's the taxpayer in the end of the day who pays for that.
Thank you, Louise. Did I miss any questions that I should have asked? I really tried to get all of it in, but it is now already almost 2 hours. If there's anything in particular that the panelists saw that you would like to answer that I didn't touch on, or any comments that you would like to make at this point, a question that wasn't asked that you thought maybe should have been asked, you're welcome to attend to that as well. Now is the time. Otherwise, I think we are going to call it an evening.
I just would like to touch, I see Andre de Georges has put in the chat box about collaborating with international hunting community to shut down the captive hunting. That has mostly happened. I don't know of any organizations who openly support the captive hunting of lions except FASA and CHASA. I know Safari Club don't, the Operators and Hunters Association of Africa don't, most Dallas Safari Club, most of them don't actively support the hunting of captive bred lions. And even if they did now, they can't get their trophies out. So I think it becomes now a question of understanding how that market's going to change and if it's regulated in any way in those new markets.
Yeah, it is interesting that you're right. On paper, Safari Club International and all those big hunting organizations in the US don't actively support count hunting, but if you actually go to their big exhibitions and you look at what is on offer, they're obviously captive bred lions rather than wild lions. So yeah, there is a bit of a disengagement there as well.
But it's mostly prevented from getting the trophies back into the US, particularly through the enhancement finding process.
Yes. Yes.
Paul, thank you very, very much for the question. We are living in a global village and it's all connected, so participating matters. Thank you so much to the whole of the African conservation community that joined us and discussed tonight, and to learn from it. Let's prevent where we can, where the countries haven't gone down that route, to not go down that route. I think there's many lessons here to be learned. So as Neil pointed out many times, let's advance with caution when we are commercializing or commercialize the use of animals. Thank you to all involved. We really appreciate your time, to the panel, and we look forward to welcoming the conservation LCA community back on in November again when we discuss climate change related issues. Thank you to all. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you, Johan. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.